Texas Comptroller Glenn Hegar, thank you so much. Welcome back to Ion Politics.
Good to be with you again.
So you've just announced that the state of Texas has a nearly $24 billion surplus. This is after the record 2 years ago, which was $33 billion. So how did the state get to this point again?
Yeah, that's the most important question, kind of how we got here, where we're at today with almost a $24 billion cash carryover balance from this 2-year budget to the next 2-year budget, which starts September 1 of this year. So as the legislature is preparing to work on this budget, I wanted to fundamentally mention that today is different than the record surplus of 2 years ago of over $30 billion, where that one was a result of all kinds of spending, individuals and businesses coming out of COVID, 40-year record high inflation. So in other words, if you paid more for an item, you paid more in sales tax to the state of Texas as a result. And then additionally, all the federal money that was flowing to individuals as stimulus dollars, as well as to state governments and local governments, that adrenaline shot into the economy, right, wrong, or indifferent, led to what we had last session. This one, the economy of Texas continues to grow, typically outpaces the national average in economic growth. We have roughly about another 1,600 people that call Texas home every day. That is hard to imagine every morning when you wake up, another 1,600 people. So the point is, the state is continuing to grow. So the growth in the last 2 years, while it was positive, it wasn't this record growth. It was much more modest. So a lot of what we have in the cash carryover balance this session, as the legislature starts on the budget, is really a large part that was left over from last time. So last time the legislature tried to invest in water infrastructure, broadband infrastructure, electric grid, reduce property taxes, so a lot of different major things they were working on, but they left additional dollars there because they knew the economy wasn't going to continue to perform as it had in the prior years.
So how much of this nearly $24 billion is left over from the last time?
Yeah, great question. The vast majority of it, a good portion of it, I'd say every bit of half plus more is left over, but then also a piece of it was the legislature last session had intended to add additional dollars into the public education school system. That was $4.5 billion. However, those dollars, that the legislation that was required to enact that funding didn't happen. And so part of this is left over. So I assume one of the big issues of the many issues they're going to talk about this session, and what to do with these dollars, how to ensure our electric grid, water infrastructure, public education is probably going to be an important starting point of putting those dollars in. And then, as we all know, the governor is very interested in, and several members in, education savings accounts. So I think those will probably be some of the big issues they start with this legislative session.
So it's economically speaking, because most of it was left over from last time. How's the state doing? I mean, sales tax revenues are still higher. Oil and gas production revenues are still higher, right? So the fundamentals are there still,
right? Fundamentals, it's kind of like building a house or building a building. The first you start with the foundation. That's the most important piece of any structure. And the foundation of the Texas economy is extremely strong. People ask me, well, what do you think and where we're going? Well, let me just tell you, first and foremost, when I wake up in the morning, I thank God I get to do my job here, and I'm not doing it somewhere else. Because some of these other states, either they are essentially don't have excess revenues in their economy anymore, or they're actually negative right now. And so our economy continues to overperform the national average. Typically, people continue to move here, businesses continue to expand. And so part of the dealing with the state costs are higher than it used to be, just like you and I, because inflation, while it has moderated, it has not gone down. And that's why one of the reasons I mentioned affordability of housing is an extremely important thing that the legislature is going to have to talk about, because unfortunately people are paying as much or more today in just their interest payments as well as their insurance portion than they are of anything else, and that is a higher percent than what it ever used to be. So we really need to focus on that from a quality of life here in the state of Texas.
I want to ask you about the rainy day fund, because that, you said, is slated to be like $28.5 billion by the end of the next 2-year budget cycle in August of 2027. Talk to me a little bit about that, because there are restrictions on how that money can be used, and that is separate from the surplus.
That's correct. So when we talk about the $24 billion left over, that is in the ordinary expenses that the state, we as the taxpayers, expect state government to have, whether it's roads, water, criminal justice, prison system, health and human services, that pieces. However, the current economic stabilization fund, or rainy day fund, which is essentially Our state savings account has $24 billion in it as well, roughly. Now, when I first got in this job 10 years ago, that fund had a little over $6 billion. So it has continued to grow, even though it only is a portion of our state severance taxes. Oil and gas severance taxes go into it. Another portion goes in the general treasury to fund public education. Another portion goes to fund transportation. But the point is that fund is continued to grow over the years. And also the legislature, I asked them to give me the tools that we can invest those dollars in a very prudent, responsible way, so we can at least make sure that we're keeping up with the inflationary pressures on those dollars, that dollar will buy the same equivalent of items next year as it would this year. So the legislature gave me those tools a few years ago. So my team here, we are entrusted with a lot of dollars on behalf of you and I, the taxpayers. And so we've been able to earn over $1 billion in that fund every year, which continues to keep up the purchasing power for whenever there's an economic downturn, which is why it was created, that someday, we don't know when, we don't know why, globally there'll be an economic downturn, and it was created in that time when there is that crisis, that car insurance bill, that repair that needs to be made in a household, or whether that air conditioner needs to be fixed or replaced that's not intended, that economy goes down in Texas as we're tied to the global economy. It's there for that rainy day, or for some type of emergency, whether that's a natural disaster. That's what it was designed for.
You hear some discussion among conservatives that the state's still spending too much money. And then you hear from Democrats saying the state isn't spending enough money as far as infrastructure, as far as health care, mental health, Medicaid expansion, public schools, et cetera. Where do you land on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if you look at anybody's individual budget within our own household, my own household, I may think we should spend a little more money on X or Y, and my wife goes, no, you've spent enough on that. And vice versa. I mean, that is the conversation we have in our own households. That's the conversations that happen in businesses. And guess what? That happens in government too. And it should, because it's a discussion of what are those priorities? How do you keep the Texas economy going? How do you make sure the working families of Texas have an economic opportunity for them and future generations? And so those are discussions the legislature has every single session. They're going to continue to have that. But the point being is, how do you find that right balance between all of those? And I trust that the legislature will have those healthy discussions this session, and they'll find on that right balance.
Property tax relief is going to be on the table again based on my conversations with lawmakers.
Yeah.
And I believe your agency just published the latest findings from the latest year of 2023.
Yeah.
And it showed that property taxes, despite the property tax cuts, the relief that the legislature passed for school taxes, they still went up by less than 1%, which of course was a lot lower than what they did back in 2022, which led the outcry.
That's correct.
But when you still look at the county property taxes, city property taxes, they each went up by 10%, and then the special districts went up 22%.
Right.
So doesn't that just negate everything, really? All the
Well,
the,
you can look
the
at
relief?
it, these over here negated this, or thankfully the legislature took action over here, or it would be even more. And so, that's the thing is, a lot of times, as I explained, with these very massive issues that we deal with as a state, it's the 8th largest economy in the entire world. These are very big issues. It's a very big state, 30 million people. You're not going to swallow the whole apple at one time, but you've got to take a bite. You've got to try to take a step on solving a problem. And if you solve enough problems, then you get further along to a solution, which is what you and I, the residents of the state, the taxpayers want. And so I try to keep a focus on, in my role and talking to the legislature, how do we address one step at a time? You're not going to get to the end destination in one step, but you're going to continue to make progress. And that's what we expect our government to do. We expect our government to solve those problems because that is their job. They are elected to resolve major issues, but it usually takes a step at a time.
And there has been a lot of discussion about, can the state just end school property taxes altogether?
Yeah.
And the lieutenant governor really pushed back hard last session on that, said it's not possible. And the Senate, I think over the summer, held hearings saying if you want to eliminate all property taxes, it's like $80 billion or something like that. There's no way, right? I mean, that's just not reality.
I think you and I, pretty much everybody, if we could eliminate property tax, that's what we would want to do. But the fact is, if you look at the math, which the legislature, the Senate specifically, had asked us to help come over and explain that, say for example, if you did a complete swap in sales tax, right now the state sales tax is 6.25 for every taxable item that you purchase. Not all items are taxable, but those that are. If you were just to raise the rate on those items alone, not expand the base, because that gets difficult, because you don't want to tax food and you don't want to tax medication, which are two big items. That's not going to happen. So raise the base. Well, you're going to raise it from roughly 6.25 to eliminate all property taxes to over 20%. And so that's pretty high. So that was the point of that discussion, is that you continue to chip away at this. Take a piece at a time. As you mentioned with school taxes, while they went up roughly around 1%, that is not 5, 10, and 15% as it had been in the past. And so that is a fundamental step in the right direction. So you continue to chip away at the stone, because you can't swallow the whole thing at one time. And that was really the point of that mathematically it's hard to get there. But that doesn't mean you don't stop trying to solve the problem. You just got to take it from a different angle.
So you think lawmakers are on the right path there?
I think they are on the right path to continue to tackle major issues, whether it's property taxes, water infrastructure, our electric grid, and again, focusing on one step at a time, solving the problem, getting to what the people of the state of Texas want, to make sure that we keep Texas economically viable and families have an affordable way of living here in the state.
With all this discussion about property tax relief, the people who are left out of it are people who don't own the homes, right? So they rent, and people inevitably ask, well, what about those folks? They've contributed to the sales tax revenues, right? They've got to buy stuff just like everybody else. And so I'm wondering, what do you think the state could be doing? Does that mean maybe more holidays, tax-free holidays to give people a break? There have been, I think there was a bill last session to lower the state property tax, but that didn't go up. That didn't go anywhere either. Would you recommend that or no?
Yeah, so I would say that the legislature has to continue to look at this holistically. In other words, if you just look at one issue in a vacuum, then it gets too complicated. But if you take it holistically, whether it's a sales tax holiday, whether there are the other major issues you're dealing with, then that provides relief. Because one of the reasons I mentioned, say for example earlier, affordable housing in the state of Texas, whether it is single family or multiple family, that is becoming more of an issue. And that impacts more the working class than anyone else in the state of Texas. And we have to really focus on that. And property tax can be a piece of it, but there's other pieces of it as well. And that's the reason I mentioned affordable housing, because that comes back to that exact issue.
I just wanted to follow up on one other thing you said, and I appreciate your time, and that is, we talk about housing affordability in the state of Texas. And I mean, it's an 800-pound gorilla in one sense.
That's right.
That it's like, how do you even begin to solve a problem? How does government solve what's in the economy, right? But on the other hand, it's very simple in the sense that people can no longer afford to put a down payment on a house. And so when you talk about solutions, what are potential solutions in your mind where it's not necessarily a government fix, but perhaps creating an environment to help?
Well, to me, one of my main goals last year in issuing this report was at least to be able to identify this is a problem. And this is a problem that if we don't at least start to look at the bigger picture, what have other states done? What are other things around the world? What are those tools in the toolbox? And then fundamentally, are those even tools we want to go down that path? You asked the point, government doesn't always do things better than the private sector. And so therefore, is that a role of government? But at least you first got to start with, what is the issue? What are the potential options that are out there? If it was easy, it would have already been done. It's difficult, which is the point of your question. It's very difficult. I don't have the best answer, but at least I do feel like it's my responsibility to elevate that discussion, that this is a major issue in the state of Texas, much like I did with pensions several years ago. If we don't shore up those pensions, that's going to be an unfunded liability that some generation is going to have to pay, and it's going to be unsustainable. Or raising up the issue of water infrastructure, road infrastructure, the major things that I think the average person cares about, and that housing affordability. No, I don't have the exact solution. I wish I did, But I do think it still requires us elevating the discussion to know this is a real problem, and if we don't figure out how to start coming up with those solutions, then unfortunately we're going to have more people, we're going to have more homelessness in the state of Texas, like some other states, and I don't think that's the direction we want to go in.
And my last question is just about insurance, which you
Yeah,
also brought up.
yeah.
Insurance has gone through the roof.
That's right.
For most people, right?
That's right.
And so, where do you think, how can that be changed? I mean, because I know there's a lot of market forces going on. We've got a lot of severe weather in this state,
Yes.
hailstorms, tornadoes, you know, ice, snow, whatever, flooding. So what's the solution to that?
Yeah, that is another really important one, because as you mentioned, whether it's housing insurance, whether it is automobile insurance, those two alone, and property, the rates have gone up astronomically in the last couple years. Now also on a flip side, unfortunately, if there's a car accident, the repair bill for that cost, because you can't get the parts. If you can get the parts, how much they've gone up. And so everything's cost more, which in part of that insurance rate. And so that's the reason, again, that is an important component, because now, used to, people paying into their mortgage every single month, about a third of the cost was their interest and also their home insurance. And now it's half. I mean, that's a big piece. And so therefore, that's the reason I pull that out. But you know, if government gets too strong-handed, then insurance companies are going to say, what? Thank you, we're leaving the market and we're going to go somewhere else. And you don't want to have that happen. You know, think about our fellow Americans that are in California right now, in LA. That is devastating. And there's a large portion of those people that don't have insurance because insurance companies left the market. And so there is that balance between the two of trying to make sure, but government can get overhanded, as we know, and then when people leave the market, there's no coverage for people. And so again, that's one of those difficult questions which you're good at asking, that maybe there's not always that simple answer. But it doesn't mean we don't continue to keep looking into it to try to find a better answer.
Texas Comptroller Glenn Hegar, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
It is always good to be with you.